about the little delay in starting this session, but now we are here live with Anjan Sundaram. Um, Anjan is an award-winning journalist, and he has reported from Central Africa for both the New York Times as well as the Associated Press. His writings have appeared in Granta, The Guardian, Observer, Foreign Policy, Telegraph, Washington Post. Oh my God, the list goes on and on. And he's written two books. The more recent one is Bad News: Last Journalist in a Dictatorship, and before that, Stringer: A Reporter's Journey in the Congo. Anjan, great to have you with us on LitFestx.
Thank you, Kumaar. Pleasure to be here.
Right. So, Anjan, how did you? I was reading your profile. You studied at Yale University, and then I mean, how did you land up in Rwanda?
Also, from Yale, I went first to Congo. It's a long story. Well,
Please tell
I was
us.
studying
Please
mathematics. I was studying mathematics, and I thought I would become an academic. And I thought I'd become an academic. I also had this job in finance at a bank. And one day I read a story in the dining hall, university dining hall, which was buried in the middle of the newspaper at the bottom of the page. Small story, but that spoke of 4 million people dead. And it shocked me. There was a sense of dissonance, powerful sense of dissonance, because the story was so small and the events it was speaking about were so large that I thought something needs to be written, more needs to be written about this place. So I bought a one-way ticket to Congo and turned myself into a journalist there. I had no journalism experience, very little money. And I went only with the conviction that whatever I was seeing and going to report on should be news.
Wow, that is fantastic. But tell me, how was your time there? I mean, of course, your book speaks a lot of the atrocities on the ground, both for people in general and also in terms of the way journalists and the media were treated. But tell us a little bit about your experience on the ground, both in the Congo and in Rwanda.
So the people in both places, the books are really about the people in both places. So Congo is about the people of Congo. I stayed with a family, a local family, and much of the book describes life in their home and how the war affects them and how they see the war. And they're an incredibly resilient, humorous even people. There's a certain tragedy about them. They have come to terms with the war, sometimes not in the most effective way, but certainly perhaps it's the only avenue open to them. And you can see that they struggle on a day-to-day basis, but they also find their moments of joy. They find their ways to enjoy themselves, build community, and carry on. Even build projects. They have creative and intellectual and commercial projects that they have continued to work on. And it's these that I report on, these sorts of small daily challenges and dreams that excited me and that I began to explore with them. In Rwanda, it was quite a different situation. I went in to teach a class of about 12 journalists. And one by one, they began to be taken out by the government as I was teaching them. And so much of the book is about their journey, standing up to a very ruthless and brutal government, and how they were, what happened to them. So one of them was shot dead on the day he criticized the president of Rwanda. 2 young women were sent to prison for many years. Others fled the country fearing for their lives. So it's really about my interactions with people. Both books are about me living with people, immersing myself in Congo and Rwanda, and coming as close to those places and people as I can.
Wow. You were obviously aware that you were in a dictatorship, right? And you haven't lived in a dictatorship before, right? So how did you make changes? What was it like?
So the first thing I would say is, first, I grew up in Dubai, which is itself an authoritarian state. And so I was sensitive to some of the ways of speaking and listening and going about their business that one is forced to adopt when one is not free, right? So those are the first things. So I had some experience, but working there was very challenging. I had to write my notebooks in code just in case the government raided my house and saw who I was talking to, saw my sources, found them out. So I would write them in code, change names, change locations, be very careful. I would send the notebooks out of the country whenever I had the chance. I would save copies of the book and send them abroad, try to keep my computer as clean as possible. Very, very sensitive to people around me and anyone who could be spying on me. And I was befriended by a Rwandan journalist. He's purported to be a journalist, but he was in reality a spy. And that was somewhat terrifying experience because I really held hope for him. I thought he could be one of the answers for the country, a real journalist. And I found out that he was actually spying on me and my colleagues, my students. So there was a lot of paranoia, a lot of stress, and Congo on one hand is difficult to live in on a day-to-day basis because there's no running water, there's no electricity, the roads are all destroyed. It's very difficult on a day-to-day basis. Rwanda is very easy on a day-to-day basis. Like many dictatorships, it's very efficient, it's clean, the services function, the roads are good. These are all hallmarks of the modern dictatorship. But as time goes on, as you get to know the people living there, people who've lost their brothers and sisters, people who are living under incredible stress, incredible pressure, it becomes very difficult to live in a place like Rwanda.
How is it on a day-to-day basis in terms of the clampdown on the press? I mean, what were the physicalities around that?
So this is the hallmark of the modern dictatorship. You don't have spies following you on the street. There aren't people being shot down. There aren't people being dragged off the street. People disappear quietly. So what you have on a day-to-day basis is, I'll describe it through a little anecdote. I met a Russian UN worker 3 days after he arrived in Rwanda. I met him at a party and I said, what do you think of the country? And he laughed and he said, it's just like the Soviet Union. I opened the newspaper this morning and there's only good news. So that's what it's like. There's only good news. And to an untrained ear, as you were asking just shortly before, to an untrained ear who hasn't experienced dictatorship, you can open the newspaper and think, oh, this country is great. But to people who know dictatorships, when you see only good news, something rings a bell, an alarm bell, and you're thinking something's wrong here. It doesn't make sense. And I met a number of people in Rwanda who lived under Tito or different dictatorships, and to all of them, immediately there was a sense of alarm. Something's going wrong here. You don't see any signs. Even in Pakistan and sometimes in India, you've had the New York Times protesting censorship. So the front page of the newspaper will be empty. Because they weren't allowed to print some piece of news. And this is how they protest censorship. That's all very well, but real censorship is when there's no blank space. It's all filled up and you don't know that something is missing. And so this is a problem. You don't know that people have disappeared the night before. You don't know people have been murdered. You don't know people have been threatened and fled the country. So none of this is reported. It's very, very difficult to find out the truth. And so I met people whose family members had disappeared or been killed. They themselves were in danger. One day they walked into the bank and found that somebody had changed their name on their bank account. The government had. And so they didn't have access to their money. So all of this is possible. These are very benign, sophisticated, and subtle ways that the dictatorship acts. It's not necessarily guns on the street, as we might imagine, or spies in trench coats.
Very, very intriguing. And did you face, any pressures from the state that time, per se?
Since the publication of the book, I've had a number of threats. I've had emails come in, anonymous emails, claiming to be from the government, saying, wonderful book, great job with the book, your friends in Rwanda are all going to die. I've had emails pretending to come from friends, but they're not. The email addresses have been modified slightly, that are trying to locate me physically. Where are you? Asking about me and trying to find out if I'm coming to Africa anytime soon. I've been sort of followed around at my talks by Rwandan embassy officials. And in the country, I think actually being Indian, was an advantage. We talk about how it's easier for Western people, Western passports in this age of closing borders and things like that. There are some advantages to being Indian. I remember when I was in Rwanda and I was in places where the government would not necessarily want me to be. I was seeing things that they wouldn't want an outsider to see. Police officers would come up to me and say, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" And I'd say, "I'm from India." They'd say, "Oh, you're just interested in money. You're just a businessman." They would just assume that. Human rights, Indian, you could never be interested in human rights. You could never be a journalist. So it just passed. And so East Africa is full of Indian businessmen and business families. They control much of the Kenyan economy, for example. So they just assumed that I was there for money to do some business, and they left me alone. It would have been much harder, I think, for a Western or a white journalist to be in those same situations and just claim they're here for business.
So whilst we were talking about free speech in emerging geographies, I think we should be talking about free enterprise in emerging geographies and how the Indian diaspora has made its impact.
Absolutely, yes. They are very influential. They were brought in during the British Empire, many of them, to help with labor and things like that. And now they've become a very influential community. As I said, in Kenya, they control the economy or control large parts of it. Uganda, they became so influential that in the 70s, Idi Amin expelled all the Indians, who many of them obtained British citizenship at the time. So many of them went to England. But yes, there's a long and storied history, and it's interesting in the current context because China is making an entry into Africa in a big way, and it's been very successful. And India, I wrote a piece about this for Caravan magazine. India, despite its history and connections, has not capitalized on those. And the Indian state hasn't really provided much support to Indian entrepreneurs who could take on the Chinese and play as equals. But Indian business people, unfortunately, are operating at a handicap because of lack of support from the state.
That's a very interesting point, Anjan. As international businesses and international businessmen find more footing in areas like Congo and Rwanda, what do you see the response of the dictatorship with regards to the freedom of the press? Clearly, international communities living in a geography will demand, freedom of the press in their own way, right?
I wish the Indians know. This is why I had such an easy time. Indians, by and large, there are exceptions. Indian sort of businessmen have run printing presses for opposition politicians in Kenya, for example. Those are the exceptions. But the general rule is that the dictatorships come and go, the Indian businessmen stay. They find a way to work with everyone. They say, "I'm not political, I'm not on your side, not on his side, I'm just here to do business. Yeah. I'll give you your cut." And so they've managed to stay. And generally, politicians, dictators don't see Indian business people as a threat. Politically, right. Because they've normally stayed out of politics. That's been the sort of hallmark and one of the keys to their success as well.
So you stayed in both these places for a fair amount of time, and so once you realized that basically there was no free press, I'm sure there must have been manifestations of that in your day-to-day life, apart from the fact that there was only good news in the paper. How did it affect society in general, your interactions, etc.?
People, you walk into a bar and you're having a conversation, someone will walk in and the whole place will go quiet. You are having a conversation at a friend's house and it often came up, this concern that the house might be bugged. Basically, people who might come together in a way, associate in a way, build associations, build bonds, they were isolated. And this is what dictators do, and this is interestingly what WikiLeaks tried to do to the dictatorships, to governments that were colluding and hiding information. WikiLeaks made it difficult for them to know who the leak might be within their organization, and therefore it split up the government networks, these power networks. So it's the same principle. But in a dictatorship, it prevents people from fighting for their rights, from associating, from sharing ideas. And this is the key to any kind of uprising or any attempt to win back your rights. You need to find people who are like-minded, who care in the same way that you do, and you build alliances with them. In a dictatorship, because you don't never know who the spy might be, it might be your neighbor, it might be your uncle, it might be your mother. It's very difficult. I met a mother who turned in her son to the government, saying because the government was plotting, her son was plotting against the government, so she went and betrayed him, and he was imprisoned. And so all this becomes very common. I remember when I was in Rwanda, I went to Myanmar, I went to Burma, because I wanted a sense for just how bad the dictatorship in Rwanda was. People were saying that Rwanda's not that bad. So I went to Burma, this big bad dictatorship. It's now Myanmar, and it was nothing. People on the street were openly criticizing the government. I was in a monastery, and the monks were criticizing the governments in their offices. And I asked them, you talk openly amongst yourselves, and they said, of course. In Rwanda, that would be impossible. You never know if your colleague might betray you, and so all speech is in code. You have to read between the lines. You really have to listen in a very different way. And that's what this book is all about, Bad News. It's about deciphering that language. You never know what is going on, but when you live through one event after another, your senses begin to kick in and tell you that create a story, right? They begin to tell you what is going on. The events are not unlinked. The events are not random and sort of arbitrary. You can begin to see patterns that aren't reported in the press, and it's really these that give you a clue as to what is going on.
And you said you were teaching 12 students in Rwanda,
right?
And,
so I was teaching. Yeah.
So tell us more about. I mean, you also mentioned that quite a few of them were basically put away.
Yes, so one of them was shot dead on the same day he criticized the government. He criticized the president in the morning, accused him of being complicit in an assassination attempt in South Africa. And that evening, he was shot dead. I went to his funeral. His wife was there with their 2 or 3-year-old child. And there were a bunch of people in black suits, government people, who were observing who was coming to the funeral to know who his friends were. So all of that's very chilling. A couple of journalists of mine, this young girl, she criticized the government and then was sent to prison for 17 years for insulting the president and for saying that some Rwandans were unhappy with their leaders. These are the sorts of things that can get you into trouble in Rwanda, in any dictatorship. I mean, I just did some reporting in India, and there are signs in India as well. I was in CP in Connaught Place, and I was asking people on the street on camera. I was asking them, are there any things you don't like about India? And they were like, no, I don't talk about the sarkar. And there was a palpable sense of. Then I asked them, what do you love about India? And immediately they opened up and they were like telling me all the things they love: the food, the culture, blah blah blah. There's a sense that when you criticize figures of power, and you're attacked, for example, and the state does not protect you, or it's the state itself that is complicit in those attacks, it's very powerful. People can become silent about things that are maybe not that harmful to speak about. They self-censor because they don't know. They don't want to take that risk, understandably. They don't know that someone will protect them. Yeah, and as I'm saying this, I wonder, what people in India are thinking. Are people going, oh my God? That's certainly a sense of what I felt in India when I was reporting there. When my TV show was aired, people from the government, people associated with the government, were like, "Get this guy off the air. He's criticizing the government." Free speech in India is such an old tradition, and it saddened me to see that even at JNU and places like that it was really being threatened. When people criticized the government, people were accused of being anti-Indian, non-Indian. Same thing happened in Rwanda. I mean, people were accused of being non-patriotic. what does it mean to be Indian? What does it mean to be anti-Indian? So we did a TV show, for example, on the idea of Indianness, and we showed how it's a very fragile idea. This idea that the government and the BJP's people in power are claiming that there's this idea of what it means to be Indian. It's very fragile, very loose. I went to a village on the Indian border with Myanmar, and the Indian village is divided into two by the border. Half of the villages in Myanmar, half the villages in India. You ask them, what do you feel? And they're like, oh, the border doesn't mean anything to us. We just cross over and we marry, and my mother is on the other side in Myanmar and my uncle is here. What does it matter? It's meaningless to them. So are they Indian? Are they Burmese? They don't see the point of having that conversation. And there are many, many communities all over India that just don't understand what the government is talking about when they say, oh, we're all Indian, we're all sort of come back from thousands of years, and etc. The fact base for that is very loose and very flimsy. India's strength is that it's an agglomeration of so many cultures, so many peoples, languages, with different histories. And it was a bit saddening to see that people were afraid to speak about ideas that